With potassium optimum, remember that plants use a lot, so it certainly makes sense to add some in the form of compost. In this soil, I would say maybe figure out what your potassium content of your soil is, of your compost. You've got a compost that's 1% potassium and you want, say, 150, 200 pounds, then that tells you how much compost to put on. And you'll be getting lots of organic matter, which is great because you need to build it up here. You get lots of soil life, which you need to build up. You'll get some nitrogen. A lot of it won't be immediately available, but you will be building up the organic nitrogen bank of the soil. And you'll get a lot of phosphorus, which is good because our phosphorus is below optimum.
But Mark, if the base saturation was way high, then you would probably go with something like potassium sulfate instead of compost, right?
No, why would I? If the base saturation were high, the compost would be fine too. If I needed a lot of potassium, if the base saturation were high.
If it was like 99, which it often is, and people use lots of compost and stuff.
Oh, base saturation, excuse me. I was thinking cation exchange capacity, if it was like 12 instead of 5.
Yeah, no, base saturation. If you already have loaded up the base saturation with, let's say, phosphorus or something else so that there's no room for the potassium.
Oh, phosphorus will not.
Okay, not phosphorus, okay, calcium or whatever.
Calcium. Well, you see the base saturation is, between magnesium and calcium, it's 86. Oh, right, yeah, okay, if the potassium are also deficient, I would use some potassium sulfate and the compost. Because you want to build that up some. But right now, if we're just working approximately feed the crop with the potassium it needs. See, the compost isn't going to bind up potassium in the organic matter the way it binds up the phosphorus and the nitrogen and the sulfur. Okay, let's quickly look at micronutrients on this test. Manganese, the NCDA has indices well over 100, and the ANL says 36 high, so there's a little disagreement there, but manganese is often very high in certain soils, depending upon the mineralogy. It can be quite high or it can be somewhat low. And I think I'm not seeing major problems with manganese toxicity. If you get over 200 parts per million on the ANL test, you might start worrying a little bit about it, especially if the iron's kind of low. The iron's like 50, and the manganese is 200. It's a bit of an imbalance there. Iron is almost never a problem in our soils because a lot of the clays the red clay is iron oxide, so you'll have plenty. Once in a while you have a soil that's low in iron, especially when your pH is high like this. Copper and zinc are more often a little deficient. We have low zinc and medium copper on the ANL. The NCDA places the zinc at 57 and the copper at 31. So looking at the two of them, I would probably say that if you're using a lot of compost, you'll probably cover most of your micronutrient needs. One micronutrient that is very often deficient and very often needs a supplement is boron. Boron is an anion and it's mobile, a lot like nitrate or sulfate. And it is indeed very low on the ANL test, and it is not shown on the North Carolina test. Now, generally, when it's 0.5 parts per million or less on the ANL test, I will recommend 1 to 2 pounds of elemental boron per acre. You want to broadcast it evenly, because if a plant gets a concentration of it, it can hurt the plant. You can go from too little to too much very easy on this one. So
a good thing to do might be to mix it very well in the compost and then spread the compost evenly.
you could do that. You got to mix it really thoroughly, or you can dissolve borax in water and spray it on.
Okay.
Or if you have the granular boron supplement, you're also putting down potassium sulfate in your actually potassium sulfate is often banned because it's fairly expensive, and if you want to get the maximum result, you put a relatively light application of potassium sulfate, but fairly near your crop row. Then if you put it between the crop rows or broadcast it, you'll waste some of it because it's very soluble. Same with sulfo mag. But another source, a good source of potassium, mulch hay. With the big caveat, make sure there ain't any resistant herbicides in it. no purity carboxylic acids, that kind of stuff. So get some clean hay. You can put that down at 3 or 4 inches. That will probably provide ample potassium, the equivalent of the amount of potassium that a heavy crop will harvest will take off. And one thing to be aware of on potassium, if you are farming a hay field, if you hay every year and you don't replenish the potassium one way or another, either with the sulfate salt or with manure or whatever, you will mine that potassium right out of that field. And also, I've seen a typical hay field, an old hay field, I've seen so many. So the organic matter looks good, phosphorus is low, thank you, potassium is very low.
Yeah, that's what's happening to me.
Yeah.
The potassium is low in all these reports on that on the field that I farmed. And there was nothing but a hay field.
Yeah, and that is a tough question for me. How are we going to close that nutrient loop? The thing nice thing about nitrogen is you can always fix it. That's why throughout development cover crops is because you can fix nitrogen by having a legume in your crop mix, and even more nitrogen if it's part legume and part something else that's going to pull it out. And once you've got your organic matter, your biological activity there, the breakdown of organic matter is going to provide most of your nutrients, especially nitrogen, phosphorus, and micronutrients. And you just have to replenish them. But crops do use a lot of potassium. And now if you're growing something like tomato or cucumber where you're tilling in the vegetative part, you're returning quite a bit of it, or if you're composting and taking the compost back out. But ultimately, I find myself recommending potassium sulfate more often than I would like, both because it is a bit salty and hard on soil life, and because it's a mined resource. It's not ultimately renewable and sustainable.
What about, I see a number of the hay fields around here where they're spreading cow manure, spreading a slurry. Is that going to be replacing?
That's going to help. Now what's going to happen though is because plants use 10 pounds of potassium for every pound of phosphorus, and livestock poop out only about 3 pounds of potassium for every pound of phosphorus. If you use just manure to replenish your potassium, you're going to end up with a phosphorus overload, which can be polluting of water area. It's a wet area here. If you had very high phosphorus, you would have some water pollution. And if you have, also you will have the issues of the mycorrhiza being shut down and tying up micronutrients as well. Now, very often, if you've been building up manure, if you build up phosphorus through manure, I've also seen that the micronutrients tend to go up as well. So if the phosphorus and zinc, especially, if they go up in parallel, they stay in balance. But you'll still have the mycorrhizal and the water quality issues.
What about wood ashes? Is there any way to effectively use those without finding the life? I mean, they're real high potassium, but they're so caustic that I'm afraid to use them.
In moderation, they're fine. They're not that caustic. You could put them on I think there was an old, I don't know if this is still used in NOP, but there was an old guideline that wood ash can go on up to 600 pounds per acre. And, which is a pretty light dusting. And on this particular soil, it wouldn't, well, actually, because it's so alkaline, if this were 5.0 and had this balance of cations, I'd say go for it, because it's got potassium and calcium, hardly any magnesium. And you're high in magnesium relative to the others, not dangerously so, but if you're going to amend, wood ash wouldn't be a bad choice. Now, if you had a soil that was a limestone soil, it was high in calcium, low in magnesium, it would not be so good. It would aggravate the imbalance. Should we look at another test? Why don't you pick one out?
Okay.
Where do you want me to go for? Remember one of the greenhouses?
Yeah, they're one of the greenhouse ones. Those are the numbers. Actually, look at number 2, the 3 that was so, you couldn't understand why the potassium was so off the charts. And I don't know either if that's the one that was used to be gravel. Number 2, it's on page 3 of the NCDA, and let's see where it is on.
Oh, is that the one in the greenhouse where the chickens had run?
Yes.
And he brought in carbon in the form of wood chips and what else? Straw, hay?
We put a lot of hay in there, yeah.
Okay, the hay will build it up.
Yeah.
Grass hay can be 2%.
Hay and compost and chicken manure.
Yeah, well the chicken manure is going to build up your phosphorus. Okay, let's look what happened. we know what this was. It was some subsoil from which gravel had been removed, and you were turning the subsoil into topsoil, and he said he added about a foot of this mixture, layering of chicken manure and
Compost.
compost.
Yeah, we use compost. Yeah, it was poor compost. It was woody compost.
Okay, well the woody stuff is quite rich in potassium too, just like the wood ash.
Yeah.
So you have that, and you have the hay, which can be 2% potassium. Okay, organic matter nice and high, no surprise there. Your pH is excellent. I mean 6.4. That's just right in the middle of the optimum range. The phosphorus 264 on the. I'm looking at the A&L test now. And if we look up at the NCDA,
356.
P is 356, which is their index, saying, well, it's grossly excessive.
Yeah.
Ideally, we would like to draw that down to about 100, and that'll take some years because vegetable harvest, each vegetable crop will take roughly 20 pounds of phosphorus per acre, which would be 10 parts per million. So you'd be chipping away 10 parts per million for each harvest.
And if we try and use compost, we're going to push it right back up again.
Exactly.
Back off on compost and then go cover crops.
Cover crops.
Yeah.
Yep. Potassium, that is extremely high. Your cation exchange, 14.4, or actually 19.3 on the NCDA test. That's probably because of a tremendous amount of organic matter. You have successfully created a lot of humus. So that's a good thing. The good news about that high potassium is you can draw it down. Don't use any more hay mulch. So because the P and K are so high, maintain your carbon and your nitrogen with cover crops. Just go cash crop, cover crop, cash crop, cover crop, and keep it, keep it covered. And another thing is because the greenhouse, you don't have rain, you don't have leaching. That's part of the reason potassium got as high as it did. There's nothing to leach now. I'm impressed that the chickens did not push your pH over 7.
They weren't into that one.
Oh, that's right. Okay, so the wood chips probably held it down.
Just a few months.
Yeah, the wood chips probably held that down. Magnesium and calcium. Magnesium is quite high, but it's not problematic. And actually, it's good that it's as high as it is because if your magnesium were 10% and your potassium were 12%, you would create a real imbalance where plants wouldn't be able to get the magnesium they need. And in fact, if you had a pasture that had potassium at 12 and magnesium at 10 on the cation exchange, and you ran ruminants on there and ran livestock on there, they could get something called grass tetany, which is life-threatening. You could lose animals. And so that's a red flag on that. Sulfur being high, that again reflects a lack of rain, I think, and the fact that all those organic materials that have quite a bit. Zinc is a good range, manganese is in a good range. Let's see, what did NCDA said? Zinc is 346, but the A&L puts it at 8.6 parts per million, which really is reasonable. You can get that up to 20 before you have to start being at all concerned. Manganese at 26, and then NCDA says it's ample. They have one index that says 205, and it says 132. Iron, of course, extremely high, but that could be the native soil. Copper looks good too. You want that copper maybe a half as much as zinc is ideal, and that's right in that range. Boron, you've actually got up to an optimal range as well. I was talking about boron. There are several crops that are particularly sensitive to boron deficiency. The whole brassica family and beets, to a lesser extent spinach. Tomatoes and carrots and other root crops are moderately sensitive. My own garden at home, where I have such good biological activity, and I have low phosphorus, medium potassium, medium calcium, and I always get the crops always look good and always show near optimum levels of these same nutrients. One day I had set out some tomatoes and they had started growing beautifully really fast, and then I went down one day and all the tips were all curled up and looked gnarly, and I said, it looks like they were hit by herbicides, and I know our neighbors are far enough away and careful enough that we didn't get drift, and I didn't know about amino pyrrolid at that time, these pyridine carboxylic acid. So my next thought was, oh my, I've got the tomato spotted wilt virus, or somebody's been smoking in the garden, which brings tobacco mosaic. So I yanked the worst plant, ran to Virginia Tech, and said, please tell me what virus is on this this tomato. And I get an email 2 days later and it said, no virus detected, check for boron deficiency. So I went back to all of the extensive notes I'd taken 5 years earlier for this nutrient management study where I'd had this result of the soil being low in some nutrients and the foliage being fine. Perfect. And I was reminded that the foliage was low on one nutrient, that was boron. So that was the one nutrient that was really not there. Everything else was just not visible by the lab, but between the soil biology and the good soil tilth, the plants could find it. But there wasn't any boron to be had. And so I sprayed a little bit of borax directly on the crop, kind of saved it. You know, I wasn't completely restored, but I saved it enough to get a crop. And then I thought, well, I should put a pound of boron on the whole garden if it's that low, so I did that. And the next year, for the first time in 10 years, we were able to grow beets worth putting on your dinner plate. I mean, we would wait for 4 months, and you have a little gnarly, woody beet that big. And now in 60 days, we're getting, you know, beets the size of a tennis ball or better. So, and then the thing about boron, you do have to apply it periodically. We're getting a little low again. I probably should go out there and just get everything another shot.
And our soils all through this region tend to be low in boron.
Yeah, it's endemic. I've almost never, I mean, this is unusual, and the reason it's high is because A, you brought in all kinds of organic matter, and B, you kept the rain off. So, fortunately, it only takes a little, it goes a long way, and so it's not like potassium salt maker putting down hundreds of pounds per acre. So I think that's what might be going on in that one.
Okay, then look at one, maybe one,
You want to look at that one right after?
3 greenhouse ones, you know, any number that begins with 3.
3, 1, 3, 11, 12. That's the one that was really
Yeah, okay.
got me noticing. Look at the potassium on the ANL test, 23, very low. When you go to look at the base saturation, it's 0.5. And you go across to the sodium, it's 0.8. Now, 0.8 sodium is okay. You want a little bit of sodium. But you just as soon have your potassium be several times the sodium and not less than. And anything you grow there is going to be so potassium deficient that it will not yield well. And if it does yield something, it probably will not be of good quality. It will either not have good stress and disease resistance or not very good flavor. And what happened to that bed? Is that the one you had tomatoes and tomatoes?
Yeah, they've been doing tomatoes for a long time, and we did supplement with, I think it had a low cation, no, it had no cation exchange capacity. We supplemented with potassium sulfate this year. And we actually did, some of the other ones were not only low in potassium, but they also had a low cation exchange capacity. Or no, very high base saturation. And so we actually did charged biochar. We charged biochar with fish emulsion and mixed it with compost and added it in there along with potassium sulfate.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, we haven't probably got a chance to look at the greenhouse yet, but things are looking real good, except for the sun golds, which I think they just go crazy and they're not good at greenhouses because they overproduce and then eventually they just stress the plant, you know? They just fruit so heavily that the plant can't do it.
Yeah. We'll go ahead and looking at the across the rest of it. The magnesium and calcium look pretty good. pH is very high, 7.4. And do you know what might have happened there?
That's the whole greenhouse, is because it hasn't been raining out forever.
Oh, so you think that
Building salts up, I think, you know?
Oh.
Yeah. What's the soluble
Now the
salt?
soluble salts are still quite low, 0.17. In fact, field 2 has a higher soluble salt, and that may be because of the chicken litter. You know, the chicken part pushed that up.
Well, then I'm wondering, you know, calcium's not that bad. I mean, I've always wondered when I look at some of these tests if somebody limed, and I think somebody did lime back in like 2003 or something.
Okay.
And they used dolomitic lime. You know.
Well, the calcium magnesium levels are pretty decent. 22.2 and 76.3 look fine to me.
Well, if it's not raining, I'm really baffled as to why
Sorry?
pH is so high there.
Yeah.
I just assumed that it wasn't raining, and I thought the solution was to get some rainwater on it and flush it, you know.
Yeah, well, you can flush it either with rainwater or irrigation water, but you know, pull off the roof is good.
Well, I mean, irrigation water, there's still evaporation in there, and there's minerals in it, there's salts, it's going to build up.
Oh, the rainwater being more
Yeah.
pure, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Micronutrients look good, except the boron on that one. The boron's very low. And that is low enough to affect tomatoes possibly. And let's see. Anything else you want to look at? You want to look at?
Then, okay, now there's new ground that's actually new ground and not subsoil.
Yeah.
And that's any of the V's, the page that has the V's.
V as in Victor?
Yeah.
Okay. Should we just,
Pick any one of the V's out.
let's do VSE.
What page are you on? In which test? BSC, I got an A and L, so I just gotta find it.
Yes, A&L, it's the one that starts with V34, it's the fourth one down, VSE.
And
And
that's
then-
on page 3, just below the middle on
Take it off?
NCDA.
You said I almost think we have to move.
Yeah, I understand, yeah, thanks, good to
Thanks.
see you.
Glad you made it. Thank you.